Dubai, Ahmed Mehdi, MD of Renaissance Energy Advisors and Senior Fellow at OIES, and Andy Laven, Managing Director at Econs. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. We just saw that one of those survey questions that had, what's going to be impacting Brent most or knock it off its perch at $65. And of course, all of those are very relevant and still in flux, or even though OPEC Plus policy is getting a little bit more predictable. Let me go to you, Iman, with that. I mean, all indications are that OPEC will again, opt to increase volumes in July by the 400 plus thousand barrels. A lot of commentary in the markets saying that that's not real. It's going to be less or more because the volumes anyway aren't what they are on paper. But the other headline that we had today, Iman, was that, OPEC are now publicly confirming that they're going to be sort of reviewing these baselines. Of course, that's not news, but it's official now. Maybe overdue. And how much do you, I mean, how do you think the market's going to interpret that, if at all, in terms of the impact that it might have?
Yeah, it's long overdue. They have rescheduled that a couple of times already. They kept pushing it back. And interestingly, the last announcement made, when was it? Yesterday or the day before? Now, in the middle of all these news
Yes, too many
headlines, I
announcements.
lost track. Yeah, I think one interesting comment on that OPEC announcement was that they have slashed the previous methodology of having the three consultants decide the new baseline and capacities, and have asked OPEC secretary to come up with a new mechanism. So that was an interesting outcome, which then also caused another year of pushback to 2027, previously anticipated 2026 before that 2025. So that I don't think is really a big thing for the market. It's going to change some of the allocations. At the end of the day, they have to decide the supply, and it will just change who caught more and who gets less caught on their plate. And it's now this specific item is for 2027. But as you started your comments, I think the market has come to the consensus that the voluntary the 8 countries with voluntary cuts can afford another month of triple unwind. It obviously comes at the right time, that seasonality demand is peaking, inventories are tight, so it allows them. Whether they choose to use this ticket now and add another 400 to the market, although again the effective physical barrel increase is not necessarily that full 400, but nominal 400. They can opt last minute to go with one unwind, and then that would be bullish for the market. But I guess currently everyone has priced in another triple unwind.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, thanks, Iman. Yeah, I'll come back to you. Andy, would you agree that it is a good time for OPEC Plus, if any time is good for them to have started to add these volumes? Seasonality, yes, but we're still seeing pretty weak demand all around, aren't we? And hesitancy on being too bullish on the outlook for macro sort of demand globally. Could they be making a mistake, or again, they can adjust things anytime, can't they? So
I
fundamentals wise, yeah.
I think that the reality is that there is so much noise in the system. It's almost better to ignore the system and say what is actually happening. OPEC wants to get back to a position where they feel more in control of the market. They can see where they're getting the market share from. And one of the things historically that's always concerned them is the ability of the OECD just to continue to ramp up production. So I think the fact that they're now starting to see kind of the shale oil getting into a little bit of trouble, not being as bullish, I think they're just going to keep the pressure up, keep kind of letting production increase over time, nothing major, just keep that pressure on the OECD production to maintain their production levels. Because what they're looking for, although OPEC specifically are about energy stability, part of energy stability is how do I actually use all of my resources?
Yeah.
And for them, they have to maintain that production. Otherwise, what are they going to do with it?
Yeah, and also maintaining some control. And this is a way, as you said, taking advantage of US production perhaps being challenged a little bit at the moment because of the price. Ahmed, let's stick to the OPEC theme for now for all three of you. And from the Iraq perspective, of course, there's been, a commentary about Iraq and Kazakhstan's compliance. And that's really, I mean, some talk of Iraq coming a bit under control, but not really. Do you see that still being tolerated going forward as these other increases happen? Why not? As things that the capacity is being stretched a bit.
Yeah, before I go into Iraq, let me just add a bit about the OPEC Plus situation because I think there's a lot of noise about market share, price wars, and I think actually, there's no evidence yet of this idea of a price war. The Saudi
Why would they want that? They wouldn't want that
yeah, the
anyway, would
Saudi
they? Yeah.
pricing has not, the Saudi OSPs did not suggest that. And also, talk about shale, you know, US liquids, crude, if you strip out NGLs, was actually already slowing down anyway, earlier in the year and towards the end of last year. I think actually on the margin, the bigger impact has been on the LPG sort of conflict between US and China in terms of tariff and tensions. And obviously WTI below 60 is putting some pressure on the margin, but there's still going to be some efficiencies, still capital budgets and last earning results, they'll continue, and that won't be felt until next year. Also, OPEC Plus, with they can do it, based upon where the forward curve is. It's still showing backwardation, so they can do it whilst the market is, as Iman said. You've got a seasonal uptick in demand. You've got the Middle East generally, not just Iraq, but across all OPEC countries are moving from trying to extract more value from their barrels. So they're moving from crude to products, and that's also being reflected as well in the value chain strategies of these countries. And Iraq is no exception, even though it's way behind the curve. When it comes to the constraints in Iraq and more generally, what does it tell you? Is that it's still concentrated in the midstream and export infrastructure capacity. Nevertheless, what is interesting is that since the last few years, upstream petroleum models in Iraq, in Kuwait, all recognize that they need to be more competitive to extract more value from their barrels. And actually, you're seeing a bit of progress there. You're seeing more integrated projects trying to be developed. Total Energies in the south, BP now in Kirkuk. Recently, the Chinese discussed an integrated project in the south as well.
Yeah, there's a headline on today's bulletin about China making more inroads into Iraq. Yeah.
Nevertheless, going back to the old issue of what will be the baselines agreed, I don't think Iraq is really part of that conversation.
No.
I think it's more countries like the UAE, and also what happens with the reallocation of the quotas as well. So.
Okay, yeah, and of course, the baselines impacts the lower volume producers who have struggled to even keep up with their quotas. Okay, thanks, Ahmed. I'll come back to you. Iman, I mean, one country within OPEC, of course, is Iran. It's kind of been excluded from any practical decisions because of the scenario, obviously, that exists there. A lot of back and forth about, are we going to see a nuclear deal? And it's looking pretty positive at the moment with Trump's rhetoric versus Israel and keep away because I want to do a deal. What's the latest sentiment there? And if we were to see an approach that looks like we are going to have some kind of agreement with the US and Iran, what would that mean for barrels on the water? What difference would it make?
Well, I have to start with our reading and assumption on these back and forth. We should always ignore Trump's comments and tweets and interviews. He just say for the sake of having said things and how he feels that moment, or if he wants to change the narrative for the time being. But then,
yeah, I mean, but some people were saying that even if it's rhetoric, the type of rhetoric he's putting out, does that mean Iran would see that as positive and perhaps be more encouraged to come to the table?
Iran knows, and the market knows, and everyone knows that Trump wants a deal out of Iran. Obviously, he wants a deal out of every other equation that he's currently
Yeah.
involved in the Russia in tariffs, but he did he does want a deal, and Iran knows that. But on the technical level, still there is a big gap between either side's expectations and willingness to accept. But also they are stuck at the first pillar, which is nuclear. And then when they resolve and come to a common ground, they have to go to the ballistic missiles, and then after that they have to go to the proxies and support for that. I think they may even never finish the first one, which is this nuclear. In our opinion, that there is a very unlikely resolution. I don't say impossible, but we put a 10% chance on that. Alternative is basically two ways. One is that Israel, which has been held back, and there was a question from Trump in his interview yesterday from a journalist that said, "Did you ask Israel to not get military?" And he said, "Yeah, I told them this is not good." But that only works until Trump and his team are negotiating with Iran over a deal. But when that deal doesn't fall through, which has a natural and interesting deadline, which is end of June, as there is another timeline approaching us with the snapback of the UN resolution and UN sanctions, then I don't think Trump can easily stop Israel. So the second scenario is Israel attacking or resuming those the military actions, and then US has to support. But our base case is continuation of sanction and tougher sanctions, and then potentially a snapback of the UN sanctions later on, which is going to continue to put a cap and potentially a decline trend. But answering your question, if others had a different view and wanted to know that, what if a deal could unlock another 200 to 300 kbd of Iranian production of crude to the market within the next 3 to 6 months after the deal is announced?
Okay, which is not that much, is it, Andy? I mean, that's not going to move things much. Maybe it's already been factored in as well. I mean, Andy, talking about sanctions, what about sort of Russian oil? There's again, is Trump going to get a bit tougher on Putin? And is that going to really impact Russian barrels or not? We have another few headlines today saying sanction tankers continue to make their way to India, to China, obviously, in terms of Iran. These secondary sanctions that we've seen on board, are they having much effect with refiners and with sort of state oil companies, or not really?
I think everybody looks at what are the consequences for me? Am I allowed to do it? Do I want to do it? Does it make economic sense? And that's really where India is. I think the answer to Russian sanction is come back in 2 weeks' time, which seems to be a continuing theme from the US at the moment. Everything gets pushed out for the next 2 weeks. I actually do think that Iran will be a deal, because that's the one deal that actually Trump can do. And almost irrespective of what it is, his party will align behind him. So I think my bias is that Iran is much more likely to happen than Russia. Russia is just going to be is kicked down the road every 2 or 3 weeks in response to a reporter's questions. So I don't see anything really fundamentally changing unless the Europeans decide they've had enough of the US and they're going to go down a very rigorous sanction approach, irrespective of what the US does.
Okay, Andy. Ahmed, would you agree with that? I mean, what's your take on the Iranian question geopolitically? Do you think that is the next deal to be done by Trump? And how likely, let's say, is that in the next 3 months beyond the June deadline?
Yeah, well, I mean, actually, I agree a little bit more with Iman here, because I do think that, that the Trump and the issue around Iran and Russia, Russia is actually a good case study for where Iran may end up. Initial alignment and expectations of, if you remember maybe 2 or 3 months ago, there was front month gas prices were under pressure because of expectations that there was going to be this recalibration between Trump and Putin over Ukraine. People back in IP week were talking about Russian oil, is it going to return to Europe? The same kind of thing. It's obviously a different scale, different oil systems here we're talking about, but nevertheless, the idea that, Trump just wants the Nobel Prize and that there just wants to be a quick deal. The complications are mounting, in the background, and already the Iranian foreign ministry have talked about, the issue around nuclear enrichment. They've talked about inspections, transparency. So you might get close, but then I think it will be sabotaged, at those specific moments. And also, let's not forget, Iranian barrels, exports are pretty high, at 1.6. They're still
Steady.
okay. There are some challenges to the oil supply chain, rising floating storage, incremental sanctions on teapots, but there's still movement, and politically, it really is just one man who decides in Iran, and so far, they're not going to rush a deal. So, and I agree with one other point, which is on Israel, and I think at the moment, geopolitically, Netanyahu is in a position where he's branded as a pariah. He's losing support from the EU. There are challenges, and so his legitimacy also depends upon a hawkish stance towards Iran. So you can't just simply treat geopolitics in the oil market like billiard balls on the pool table. They all fit in the pocket nicely. It's quite messy.
Yeah, that he is. Well, certainly there's some at least external pressure, apparently coming on. Whether that'll make any difference, practically speaking, we'll see. Iman, let's talk a bit about sort of more macro. We've got Trump doing what he's doing on trade, and of course that's impacting China's thinking as well, and how it's dealing with that in the most immediate sense in terms of its shipping, exports, and manufacturing to the US. We've seen a lot of dynamics there, but also just the sentiment of demand in China. Is there a hesitancy, do you think, in terms of demand for oil, and what we've seen there in the second quarter so far? And many people say China's not going to give in on the trade talks. They're going to hold their ground. But really, what impact could that have on their oil demand, do you think, in terms of economic impact?
Yeah, I agree with the poll that you had in the beginning with the audience. I think that everyone voted for the trade war as the bigger or marginally bigger, but I would put that way ahead of every other thing. That trade war, basically the biggest one being China, but basically every other tariff negotiation and deal made, that could potentially have a larger impact on the market fundamentals than Iran deal. As I mentioned, we believe there is maybe 300 kbd max surplus oil coming from Iran, but we have already slashed our oil demand forecast growth in 2025 from 1.3 originally down to about 800 kbd. That's 500 kbd gone, way larger than Iran deal. And then if there is no resolution within the next 3 to 6 months, basically Trump pulling back and bringing all the trade barriers back to normal, we may see a recession, and we could see that 800 kbd also gone. Right now, even for the second half, we have a much lower demand growth of 650. So I think those tariffs are essential, and I think Trump is going to pull back. There's no other way. I don't think there's an easy win in that for Trump to basically get a huge amount of tariffs and import duties from all the countries, including China.
Yeah, thanks. Andy, what about Trump pulling back from his sort of other, in terms of the bond turbulence that we saw recently, and now he's trying to pass this big, beautiful tax bill, which, obviously is contrary to his argument that he's also trying to, reduce debt to an extent because he's going to put the markets into turmoil. And we've seen a recovery, obviously, in equity markets, and bond markets have calmed down, but still a lot of nervousness there, right? And would the oil market care about that? Obviously, that is an indicator for what the US economy might go through in the fourth quarter, mostly.
I have to say, welcome to Taco Thursday. That's just so amusing. I would love to be a fly on the wall in the White House when they kind of wake up to another unelected judge stopping the executive orders. I think that the US is a real dilemma because some of what he is doing, his intent is quite appropriate. It's just sometimes the way or the approach that is taken causes all sorts of upsets. And I think it is really fascinating to look at the way the market is responding, which is kind of telling you what the longer term view is, or at least the medium term view is, versus the way countries and the governments are responding. I think,
and that is a bearish response. Markets, you're talking about oil markets or just
I
all
think
markets?
so. A lot of it goes into it. I think where the markets are getting to is a level of concern if things keep going the way that they would like it to, because exactly as you've said, the duality of, hang on a minute, you want to cut the debt, but you're adding to the debt at the same time. How does that work? And you can see the frustration in Musk when he's been charged with reducing the debt by reducing costs, and then suddenly they get added back on somewhere else. It's kind of like if I was in his employment, I'd kind of, what on earth am I doing? This is just a waste of time. So I think through it all, you kind of have to say, well, what's actually going to happen, right? The bill that got passed in the House is not going to get passed. It's not going to happen. The Senate has already said, there's numerous Republicans said, it's not going to happen. Even Trump is now saying he's going to have to get involved, and there's going to be some big negotiations. Yeah. Bits of it he likes, the bits he doesn't like. Of course, he doesn't tell us which bits. So I think,
and he's certainly facing, and he's, sorry to interrupt, he's certainly facing a lot of opposition. I mean, even from sort of big names in banking, the likes of Jamie Dimon, that even one of the tech voices have now started to speak up, even though they were standing behind him. So yeah, he's getting some real opposition from his supporters, if you like. Thanks, Andy. I'll come back to you. Ahmed, let's talk a bit about products and what they're doing in the market, in terms of reacting to this, the oil price that's now maybe sort of stabilized a little bit, but it's still a lot of volatility to come. We saw margins improve a bit in refining, but again, how's that looking ahead of sort of summer, peak gasoline, jet demand? Any support being seen there from that?
Yeah, I mean, just a sort of snapshot of the most relevant parts of the product market. I think one aspect that is interesting, I think if you look at the fuel oil cracks, which have been pretty resilient and quite strong, which is to be expected based upon the seasonality. But again, that should also relate back to the issue of Saudi being the only country within this crude collective that can actually add real physical barrels beyond the nominal amount. But then within the context of fuel oil cracks, that may actually lead to, because they're so high, that may lead to actually more crude burning perhaps in the summer. So that could absorb some of the incremental barrels. So obviously fuel oil cracks, with bunker demand. I mean, if you look at what happened in Q1, a lot of heating demand and bunker demand was very strong, and also a lot of players were anticipating tariffs, so there was a bit of a front-loading effect. But margins are still holding up. When you look at tariffs and refined product pricing, gasoline overall, based upon balances and pricing, is not expected to receive the hit. It's more on the gas oil side of the equation, and that's already being reflected also in container traffic, freight. In terms of what actually happens throughout the rest of this year, whether or not you start to see some retrenchment from the Trump team based upon some of the points Andy was making around how difficult it will be to pass through some of this, some of these issues, also remains a question. The final thing I think, which is less discussed but also quite interesting, is around the LPG flows, because even though there's been a reduction based upon the plus 100% or whatever it was on Chinese reciprocal tariffs on US LPG, there's still a bit of hesitation from the Chinese to continue that trade, and purchasing from non-US players means that it does hit some of the US shale at the margin, because the shale economics also gets impacted by NGL's production. So it is an interesting part of the equation as to how forward product pricing actually could end up feeding into crude and what that relationship looks like going forward.
Okay, thanks. And of course, we've also seen a big imbalance of the sweet sour barrels, haven't we? Because of the cuts and because of obviously the impact that's being had on US production as well. There's our survey question for today, which is US-Iran. Is that more likely now than ever? I.e., is this the most likely stage that we've been at? And we had our speakers' responses from that. And will that be bearish for oil markets? Agree or disagree? Iman, what about geopolitical? I mean, and Ahmed was just mentioning there, flows, but the geopolitical risk of shipping. Have we seen anything change in the last 3 months, particularly in regards to Suez, Straits of Hormuz, the nervousness around that, or is that the new normal now? And will things go back and change back to not going around the Cape of Good Hope, do you think, if we see, for example, an Iran nuclear deal? Or has the industry made its adjustments and doesn't trust what might happen?
No, I think this is the new norm for now. The industry has certainly adjusted. There has been operational adjustment, new practices in terms of handling smaller cargoes, being loaded into bigger ships and everything else. So I think we may see this system stay for quite some time, if not forever, unless there is a very kind of persistent change in the state of security, and especially with regard to the Houthis and potential threat. Or the deal
that's gone very quiet, though, hasn't it?
That has gone very
since
quiet.
Trump
but I think
had an agreement with them, yeah.
Exactly. So that was a good step, but until things are fully kind of settled, I think this is going to be the new norm. And I think right now, as we hear a lot from our clients, everyone's paying a little bit more attention to the likelihood of Strait of Hormuz closure if the alternative scenario of an Israel attack on Iran, and the likelihood of Iranian retaliation by closing the Strait of Hormuz. So that has become, in my opinion, more of a concern for the shipping than the Suez Canal. I think that's all done and sorted, in my opinion.
I think many people are dismissing that Israel would proceed with anything without US backing, because again, economically, that would be obviously massive, wouldn't it, for the US economy and anyone else. Andy, I mean, we had a couple of commentators this week talk, about the oil price. I'm not telling you to predict where we're going, but that we haven't hit a low. We obviously saw it dip below 60, but it's got to dip even a bit below that before we see, a sort of move up again, if indeed we do. Do you think that OPEC or Saudi has a tolerance for oil being under $60 if we do go there again? Maybe you could say they've been lucky that it didn't stay below that in the last month or so circumstance. How low would they tolerate? What's the floor, do you think, before they would take action?
I think, well, gosh, there's two elements to the question. One is the absolute price, and the second is how long does it stay that low? And I think I remember one of the commentators were talking about even the Saudis have an ability for it to go below their break even. So it really does depend on those two things, how low and how long. I think that if it dips below 60 and then stays for a month below 60, I think OPEC would start to get concerned, because then they're starting to worry that actually we've now in a different channel. I think they're not necessarily comfortable with where it is, but it gives them enough meat on the bone. It allows them to move forward with their strategy. So I think anything over a month below 60 would create concern amongst OPEC.
Yeah, and there's more concern about the second half of the year economically anyway, isn't there? Like, this trade, tariff concerns, yes, they might clarify, in the next month or two, but the negative impact on companies is expected to really manifest more in the fourth quarter, what's happened so far in terms of planning. But we'll see what happens. There's our result, 69%. Okay, so most people.
I'm certainly happy about this
we had mixed opinions on the panel today, but we'll see what happens. Thanks so much to Iman and Ahmed and Andy today for joining us, everyone, and have a good remainder of the week. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.